now we cross over to our Usuyang for Global Insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks a lot, Morgan. It is indeed now time for Global Insight, where we connect to experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. Now, after President Moon Jae-in proposed seeking an end-of-war declaration on the Korean Peninsula during the UN General Assembly last month, the idea has been gaining traction in recent weeks. US Special Representative for North Korea Sung Kim visited Seoul last Friday to meet his South Korean counterpart Noh Kyu-duk, who said that the declaration was extensively discussed, among other issues. But it's unclear how far along they are and how close they are to an agreement, as the North has continued to fire missiles over the past month, as well as accusing the US of hostile policies. So will the two Koreas soon declare an end to their 71-year-long war? To discuss the prospects of an end-of-war declaration, we're joined by Bruce Bennett, Senior Defence Analyst at RAND Corporation, and Jessica Lee, Senior Research Fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. A very warm welcome to you both. And well, let's kick off first with you, Bruce Bennett. The US envoy on North Korea affairs, Sung Kim, he expressed optimism about diverse initiatives to engage North Korea, but it isn't very clear how far along the US and South Korea are right now when it comes to ending the 1950 to 53 war. And of course, it's something that Seoul's been pushing for very actively, but it seems that Washington isn't as enthusiastic about it. Where would you place an end-of-war declaration when it comes to the US's priorities on North Korea?
Well, I think we have to remember that an end-of-war declaration for 1950 to 53 is incomplete. It doesn't bring peace. We have many experiences historically where one country has wanted a peace declaration by others, such as the Munich Agreement during 1938, when the British Prime Minister Chamberlain came back and declared in Britain that he had achieved peace for his time. And he got exactly the opposite. A year later, he had war. So the U.S. is much more cautious with North Korea. We're concerned that North Korea continues to wage a Cold War against the United States, as it has for 70 years almost. And so the U.S. is cautious on this whole thing. What is it that North Korea is going to do to achieve peace? Are they going to stop calling the U.S. their major adversary? Are they going to change their indoctrination procedures? Those would be necessary to have real peace.
Well, admittedly, that the North has been launching a lot of missile provocation in recent weeks. And, well, Jessica Lee, to bring you into the conversation, why is South Korea pushing for an end-of-war declaration at this point when things are pretty uncertain with North Korea? And as Dr. Bennett just pointed out, it isn't really clear how they're going to pursue peace or denuclearization. Why is this declaration needed at this point?
Well, I agree with Bruce that this is one of many steps that need to be taken for there to be actual peace and stability on the peninsula. I have argued that it could be a catalytic move, a first and necessary move to close the chapter of the Korean War, which for Americans like us, it's actually the longest war. It's what some in Washington call forever war. It just kind of goes on and on. So I do think that as a preamble or a catalyst that it could serve a useful purpose. Now, of course, once an end of war declaration is made, we need to then talk about other things, whether it is North Korea's willingness to declare and begin dismantlement of its nuclear facilities and sanctions and other things that both sides, United States and North Korea, have tried to talk about in Hanoi and Singapore, but failed to do. So I do think South Koreans see this opportunity as an important moment. There is what some call arms racing going on in South Korea and North Korea right now in terms of the two countries really seeing each other through a lens of suspicion and, they're on high alert. And so things are quite volatile. So this is not a situation that's sustainable or should continue. And I think South Korea is a major ally of the United States. It's an important country for the United States to listen to and to work closely with to finally close this chapter of American history and to actually facilitate lasting peace.
And Dr. Bennett, given the volatility of the situation, some believe that it's rather dangerous to announce an end to the Korean War when the North hasn't committed to the process of denuclearizing or is even talking about denuclearizing just yet. What is your opinion on this?
Well, I think we have to go back and again say, what is required to have peace? Will we have peace if North Korea still wants to split the ROK-US alliance, still wants to have military capabilities, including nuclear weapons, to threaten South Korea? We need to find out what North is thinking about how it will participate in peace. Notice that the State Department has also been saying North Korea complains about our hostility, and yet they are unwilling to tell us what it is they think we need to cease in order to overcome our hostility. We want them to tell us what we need to be doing. North Korea refuses to do that. So that makes it difficult for the U.S. to move ahead and take action when we don't know what's necessary. The other problem is, quite truthfully, North Koreans' hostility is far greater than the American hostility towards the North. The North is far more hostile towards the United States. And yet we hear nothing about them prepared to reduce their own hostility. That is the other problem I think we face.
And Ms. Lee, well, even after showing enthusiasm for ending hostilities with South Korea, Pyongyang continued to fire missiles into the EC, most recently last week. What do you think were the regime's intentions behind this?
Well, that's right. I mean, the situation on the peninsula is quite tense. Earlier this month, the North and the South both tested ballistic missiles, hours apart from each other. And this was North Korea's first test in about 6 months. And so it's a fresh breach of UN Security Council resolution as well. And so it's quite grave. And then, of course, on October 19th, North Korea launched a ballistic missile from a submarine, which again shows that the tension on the peninsula is not likely to go away anytime soon, and that the status quo is getting more and more dangerous. And then most recently, South Korea, of course, tested its first domestically made space rocket earlier this week. And so I think, we have to step back and look at the picture and ask ourselves, where is this situation headed? I think there are all three countries, United States, South Korea, and North Korea, deserve some blame for being quite vague about the concessions they're willing to provide. And so we, are perennially in the state of a guessing game. And thankfully, there are members of Congress in Washington that are looking at this issue critically. So, for example, there's a bipartisan bill called the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act that would voice support for a binding peace agreement, as well as call for an establishment of liaison offices. And so I think these are the ways in which we can reduce tensions, get to know both sides' concerns in a more normal, less hostile, less volatile manner. And it's probably the only way that we can avoid some sort of a military confrontation at this point.
And Dr. Bennett, some worry that if there is an end of war declaration or some kind of peace declaration, China and North Korea might push for the removal of US troops from the Korean Peninsula. Is this a legitimate concern?
Well, North Korea has moved back and forth on the subject. Sometimes they've said that they are happy to have US troops on the peninsula, but most recently they've been saying that they do want US troops removed from the peninsula. So we have to look at the South Korean opinion polls. 90% of the people roughly in polls are saying they want US troops in Korea. That's one of the hangups. If that's a criteria for North Korea to have peace in reality, then we're not going to do that. We're not going to abandon our South Korean ally. That would be terrible for the US to do, especially with North Korea building nuclear weapons. And it would be destabilizing because it would drive many in Korea to think that they would need their own nuclear weapons if there's not any extended deterrence support from the United States.
And Dr. Bennett, North Korea has of course been launching a string of provocations in recent weeks, yet they do seem quite eager for talks. What do you think they want exactly from South Korea and the US?
Well, you have to look at their provocations. Their provocations have been almost exact matches of the South Korean missiles. similar range cruise missiles, similar range ballistic missiles, a supersonic missile launch, not hypersonic apparently, that South Korea had done something similar. They're trying to prove that the international community has a double standard to get sanctions reduced. And they're also trying to show their own military that there is nothing in which South Korea is superior to the North. So they're facing a concern of trying to still look like they are very strong, superior, get sanctions reduced. Those are the things they seem to be after with their launches, and it seems duplicitous to be interested in a peace agreement when they are carrying out far more missile tests than South Korea has been testing.
Now, Ms. Lee, while the Biden administration has reiterated that it's open to talks with North Korea and that it has no hostility towards the North, Pyongyang has constantly slammed Washington and accused it of having hostile policies. What should be the approach then to engagement with the North in this kind of situation?
Yeah, I mean, I recently wrote a foreign policy article detailing, the conditions right now where there seems to be some positive movement on the diplomatic side, talks happening in Jakarta, Washington, D.C., of course, Seoul. But, we need to also think about, okay, how do we get back to the negotiating table? And I do think that there is a question right now about the off-ramps for the countries involved. Certainly, the United States does not want to appear too forward-leaning without some sort of assurance and coordination among allies in the region that this path toward peace is something that is viable, that makes sense, that can be done without further destabilizing the peninsula. So I do think that there's significant work that lies ahead. But the point is, the Biden administration and the State Department seems particularly invested in this process and has been forward-leaning, in making, clear to the American public that this is an important issue. This is something that should have been done long ago, and that the more we use fear tactic to stall a peace process, more likely we're going to see a further destabilized Korean peninsula going forward.
Ms. Lee, well, President Moon, he's going to leave office next year. What do you think his administration is going to do to solidify the South's engagement with the North before he leaves?
Well, as you said, this is a very tense and politically, potent time in South Korea because of the presidential election that's only about 5 months away. So I think for President Moon, because this was one of his signature foreign policy initiatives, he's obviously very invested in this and wants to see more progress. I think what's really interesting, too, is the amount of attention the North Korea issue has been getting among conservative candidates as well. So whether it's Yoon Suk-yeol, who really came out in recent days criticizing President Moon's idea of an end-of-war declaration, calling it a delusion. And also Hong Jun-pyo, another conservative candidate who, has said South Korea should build its own nuclear weapons because the talks are not going anywhere, and we need to really focus on the reality of the matter, which is that talks are not happening. And so there's I think various degrees of pessimism and concern by some, South Korean presidential candidates, and of course on the progressive side, South Korean presidential candidate Lee Jae-myung has, of course, I think he's more known as a domestic kind of, economics guy with the universal basic income and other plans. And I think he's, likely going to continue some of the engagement policy of the Moon administration. But a lot of this, I think, has to do with the amount of influence Washington has on this process. And for us to really prioritize it rather than fixate on this zero-sum ideological narratives and policies with China, which unfortunately will have an effect on U.S.'s North Korea policy as well. So it's time for cooler heads to prevail. It's time for North Korea experts to really look at this issue, and to really come up with a roadmap that isn't going to be a sideshow to Washington's sort of fixation on China at this moment.
And Dr. Bennett, while Sung Kim and Noh Kyu-duk, they've been speaking for weeks and weeks on how to engage North Korea, and it seems that they've been constantly saying that the ball is in North Korea's court. But do you think there's anything more that can be done, or what do you think really should be the approach to engagement with North Korea?
I think the ball really is in North Korea's court. The U.S. has said it will meet anytime, anywhere with the North Korean representatives. I heard in a webinar recently one of the senior officials in the State Department say The U.S. is tired of negotiating with itself over what North Korea might want, because we don't know what North Korea wants. It won't say. And we're not going to just give North Korea all kinds of benefits simply to try and guess what they would like. So North Korea needs to come forward, tell us what they want, and then we can decide whether or not it makes sense. To simply give North Korea more concessions on top of all of the concessions the U.S. has already given. If there were a balance sheet drawn of what has been done in recent years, the U.S. would win it hands down, despite North Korea's propaganda to the opposite. So it's time for North Korea to say what it is they want so we can make a decision about, is that the world we want to live with?
Well, this is where we'll have to wrap up today. That was Bruce Bennett, Senior Defence Analyst at RAND Corporation, and Jessica Lee, Senior Research Fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.